All right, history buffs and drama lovers, ever wondered what it takes to be a queen? Not just any queen, but the kind who inherits an empire on the brink of collapse, stares down a continent of greedy kings, and then, just for good measure, raises 16 children? Yeah, you heard that right. We're talking about Maria Theresa, the ultimate mother of empires, and in many ways the first queen to truly go to war. Her life wasn't a fairy tale. It was a brutal, beautiful, and sometimes heartbreaking testament to sheer grit. Get ready to dive deep into a saga of power, passion, and profound personal sacrifice. To understand Maria Theresa, we first need to set the stage, Europe in the early 18th century. This wasn't a world of nations as we know them today, but a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and empires, all vying for supremacy. At the heart of it all lay the venerable House of Habsburg, a dynasty that had shaped European destiny for centuries. Their power base, the sprawling Habsburg monarchy, was a bewildering mosaic of diverse lands and peoples. The Archduchy of Austria, the Kingdom of Bohemia, the Kingdom of Hungary, parts of Italy, the Austrian Netherlands, and numerous smaller territories. It was an empire held together less by geography than by the personal rule of its monarch and the ancient traditions of loyalty. The reigning emperor, Charles VI, Maria Theresa's father, was a man consumed by one overarching fear: the extinction of his ancient lineage. For generations, the Habsburgs had been plagued by a notorious lack of male heirs. The Spanish branch had died out in 1700, sparking a brutal war of the Spanish succession. Now it seemed the Austrian branch was headed down the same perilous path. Charles VI had two daughters, Maria Theresa and Maria Anna, but no sons. In an age where women were strictly excluded from inheriting sovereign power in most European states, this was an existential crisis for the dynasty. The ancient Salic law, a principle embedded in German legal tradition, explicitly forbade female succession to land and title. Charles VI, a learned but often indecisive man, became utterly obsessed with circumventing this historical barrier. He poured all his diplomatic energy and political capital into drafting and securing the Pragmatic Sanction. This was a revolutionary legal document, first issued in 1713, which declared the indivisibility of the Habsburg lands and crucially decreed that they should pass to his daughters in the absence of male heirs. It was a bold, almost desperate gamble against centuries of tradition. For decades, Charles VI embarked on an exhaustive, humiliating, and incredibly expensive campaign to get every major European power to recognize and guarantee the Pragmatic Sanction. He bribed, he cajoled, he threatened, and he made countless concessions. To Spain, he gave up economic advantages. To France, he made promises regarding territorial claims. To the various German princes, he offered titles and subsidies. Each signature on the Pragmatic Sanction felt like a victory, a nail in the coffin of uncertainty. He believed that if enough powers put their names to the document, Maria Theresa's succession would be unassailable. He truly believed that a piece of paper backed by international agreement was stronger than armies and ambitions. It was a tragic miscalculation, one that would plunge his daughter and his empire into an unimaginable struggle. While he was focused on this grand diplomatic chess game, Charles VI arguably neglected the practical preparation of his heir. Maria Theresa, though intelligent and vivacious, wasn't given the rigorous political and military education that a male Habsburg heir would have received. Her father seemed to think that simply securing the right to rule was enough, not realizing that the ability to rule, especially in a time of crisis, required far more than a legal document. This oversight would become painfully clear the moment he closed his eyes for the last time. Maria Theresa was born on May 13, 1717, in Vienna, the magnificent capital of the Habsburg Empire. Her arrival was met with a mixture of joy and apprehension. Joy because she was a healthy child, apprehension because she was a girl. Charles VI, ever the optimist, initially held out hope for a son. His second child was also a girl, Maria Anna. It wasn't until Maria Theresa was 6 years old that her brother Leopold John was born, only to die tragically in infancy. This loss cemented Maria Theresa's position as the primary heir under the Pragmatic Sanction, a destiny she could not escape. Her early life was, by royal standards, remarkably happy and relatively carefree. She was described as a beautiful child, with lively blue eyes, a powerful presence, and a clear, commanding voice that would later serve her well in negotiations. She inherited her father's love for the arts, particularly music, and developed a lifelong passion for theater. She was fluent in Latin, French, and Italian, and was reasonably well educated in history, philosophy, and the sciences of the day. However, her true passion lay in riding and hunting, activities usually reserved for men, hinting at the independent and robust spirit that lay within her. Her education, while broad, lacked a crucial component: practical statesmanship. While she sat in on some council meetings, she was never given a significant role or taught the intricacies of governance, finance, or military strategy in the way a male heir would have been. Her father, blinded by his reliance on the Pragmatic Sanction, seemed to believe that her destiny would simply unfold without needing direct, hands-on preparation. Instead, her training leaned more towards being a suitable royal consort, a mother, and a cultured figurehead. This oversight would prove to be one of the greatest challenges she faced when she unexpectedly ascended to the throne. At the tender age of 18, Maria Theresa fell deeply in love with Francis Stephen of Lorraine. This was an extraordinary occurrence in a time when royal marriages were almost exclusively political arrangements. Francis Stephen was a charming, handsome, and intelligent man, though perhaps lacking the forceful personality often expected of a monarch's spouse. Their union in 1736 was a genuine love match, a source of immense personal happiness for Maria Theresa throughout her life. He was her confidant, her emotional anchor, and the father of her vast brood of children. Their relationship was a rarity, a true partnership in an age of calculated alliances. He brought her joy and stability, but also, at times, a sense of political frustration, as his talents lay more in administration and finance than in military command or grand strategy. The 1730s, Maria Theresa's young adulthood, were a period of escalating tensions across Europe. Charles VI's foreign policy, driven by his obsession with the Pragmatic Sanction, often left the Habsburg monarchy weakened and indebted. The War of the Polish Succession, 1733 to 1738, saw Austria lose important territories like Naples and Sicily, further draining the treasury and exposing military weaknesses. These were ominous clouds on the horizon, largely unheeded by a Charles VI still convinced that paper agreements would protect his daughter. Then on October 20th, 1740, the unthinkable happened. Charles VI died suddenly, possibly from eating poisonous mushrooms. Maria Theresa, just 23 years old and pregnant with her fourth child, was now the Archduchess of Austria, Queen of Bohemia and Hungary, and ruler of the vast, disparate Habsburg lands. The weight of an empire burdened by debt, a weak army, and fractious nobility fell squarely on her young, unprepared shoulders. Her immediate reaction was one of profound shock and grief. She adored her father, despite his political shortcomings, and his sudden absence left a vast void. But there was little time for mourning. The ink was barely dry on the pragmatic sanction. But the moment Charles VI's breath left his body, the treaties signed with such fanfare began to unravel. The oaths of allegiance given by the other European powers evaporated like mist. Within weeks, the vultures began to circle. The first and most audacious was Frederick II of Prussia, a young, ambitious, and utterly ruthless monarch, later known as Frederick the Great. He had inherited a powerful, well-disciplined army and a rich treasury, and he saw Maria Theresa's succession as an unmissable opportunity. Just 2 months after her father's death, in December 1740, Frederick invaded Silesia, one of the Habsburg's richest and most strategically vital provinces. His pretext was flimsy historical claims, but his true motive was naked opportunism. He believed he could snatch Silesia from a young, inexperienced woman without a fight. This wasn't just a territorial dispute. It was a direct, contemptuous challenge to Maria Theresa's legitimacy and a blatant disregard for the pragmatic sanction. It ignited the War of the Austrian Succession, a brutal conflict that would engulf Europe for the next 8 years. Suddenly, all those European powers who had sworn to uphold her right to rule decided that a young, untested woman on the throne was an irresistible chance to grab land and increase their own power. Bavaria, France, Spain, and Saxony all joined the fray, each with their own territorial ambitions and claims to Habsburg lands, seeing her as an easy target. The newly crowned Queen King, as the Hungarians would eventually call her, faced not just one enemy but a continent-wide conspiracy to dismember her inheritance. Maria Theresa was in an impossible position. Her treasury was depleted from her father's diplomatic spending and past wars. Her army was scattered, poorly supplied, and inadequately led. Her government was riddled with corruption and inefficiency. Her advisors, many of them old men from her father's court, were either terrified, indecisive, or outright disloyal, whispering doubts about a woman's capacity to rule. The situation looked utterly hopeless. But here, amidst the chaos and despair, is where the true steel in Maria Theresa's character began to shine. She refused to yield. She would not allow her father's legacy or her family's ancient heritage to be torn apart. Her initial reaction was not panic, but a fierce, unyielding determination to fight for what was hers. She might have lacked experience, but she possessed an indomitable will and a profound sense of duty. She quickly realized that she could not rely on the promises of others. She had to rely on herself and on the loyalty of her disparate peoples. It was a baptism by fire that would forge her into one of Europe's most formidable monarchs. The early days of Maria Theresa's reign were a maelstrom of emotional and political pressure. Imagine being 23, pregnant, grieving your father, and simultaneously facing the potential disintegration of an ancient empire. It's almost unimaginable. Her private letters from this period reveal a woman pushed to her absolute limits, yet refusing to break. She confessed to her sister-in-law, "I find myself without money, without credit, without an army, without experience, and without knowledge." Yet this frank admission of vulnerability was always coupled with a resolute statement of defiance. Her deep faith was a constant source of strength during these dark days. A devout Catholic, she believed firmly that God had placed her on the throne for a purpose, and that it was her sacred duty to protect her inheritance for her children and for the Catholic world. This wasn't just political rhetoric. It was a deeply held personal conviction that fueled her resilience. She would spend hours in prayer, seeking divine guidance and strength to face the challenges ahead. One of the most powerful and often recounted personal stories from this period is her plea to the Hungarian Diet in Pressburg, modern-day Bratislava, in September 1741. Hungary, a proud and fiercely independent kingdom within the Habsburg realm, had a history of strained relations with Vienna. They had often been a source of rebellion, and their loyalty was by no means guaranteed. Maria Theresa, desperate for troops and funds, decided to appeal directly to them. She traveled to Pressburg, dressed in traditional Hungarian mourning attire, and entered the Diet Assembly, holding her infant son Joseph, who was just 6 months old, in her arms. She stood before the assembled Hungarian magnates, a room full of powerful, skeptical, and battle-hardened men. In a clear, impassioned speech delivered in Latin, she invoked her lineage, her divine right, and, most crucially, appealed to their ancient honor and chivalry. She spoke of the enemies who threatened her realm, her sex, and her children, asking for their aid. She reportedly declared, her voice trembling but firm, "The realm of Hungary, our person, our children, our crown, are in the greatest peril. Forsaken by all, we place our sole hopes in the loyalty and valor of the Hungarians." The effect was electrifying. Many sources, though possibly embellished by later Romanticism, describe the magnates drawing their ancient sabers and crying out in a thunderous roar, "Vitam et sanguinem pro rege nostro Maria Theresa," our life and blood for our King Maria Theresa. They referred to her as king to emphasize their loyalty to the office rather than a gender, in accordance with their traditions. This wasn't just a political pledge, it was a deeply emotional moment, a spontaneous outpouring of loyalty that genuinely moved Maria Theresa to tears. This scene, whether entirely accurate in every detail or partially mythologized, captures the essence of Maria Theresa's power, her ability to inspire devotion, to tap into a deeper sense of loyalty that transcended mere legal arguments. She didn't just ask for help, she evoked a powerful emotional connection, presenting herself not as a helpless woman, but as a courageous monarch fighting for her home and her children. This moment secured her the crucial Hungarian support she desperately needed, providing her with a much-needed army and a psychological boost that rallied her own spirits and those of her loyalists. It proved that her strength lay not just in her royal blood, but in her capacity to stir the hearts of men. Away from the grand stage of politics, Maria Theresa's personal life was a constant juggle of state affairs and burgeoning motherhood. She was constantly pregnant during the war years, giving birth to 5 children between 1737 and 1743 alone. Imagine leading an empire through war, negotiating treaties, and enduring the physical and emotional toll of frequent pregnancies and childbirth. Her days were a relentless cycle of state business, often conducted with infants or young children nearby. She would sometimes breastfeed while receiving ministers or reviewing dispatches, blurring the lines between private and public life in a way unheard of for a reigning monarch. This wasn't just practicality, it was a clear declaration that her roles as mother and monarch were intertwined, that her children were part of the very fabric of her claim to the throne. Her letters to her husband, Francis Stephen, during these early turbulent years reveal a deep bond and a reliance on his emotional support, even as she often had to overrule his sometimes cautious advice on political matters. She genuinely loved him, and his presence was a source of great comfort. He was her anchor, allowing her a private space where she could be a wife and mother, away from the relentless demands of her imperial role. This private joy, however, was always shadowed by the constant threat of war and the immense personal cost it demanded of her. She was a woman constantly torn between the terrifying responsibilities of her crown and the intimate joys and sorrows of her family. The weight of her empire was a heavy burden, but the thought of her children was her greatest motivation. The very foundation of Maria Theresa's reign, the pragmatic sanction, became the central point of historical controversy and argument. On paper, it was a triumph of Charles VI's diplomatic efforts, recognized and guaranteed by virtually all the major European powers. Yet in practice, it proved to be little more than a scrap of paper the moment a strong male ruler saw an opportunity. Historians grapple with several key questions regarding this period. Was Charles VI naive to believe that paper agreements would hold in the face of political ambition? Or was he simply a victim of circumstances attempting to solve a centuries-old dynastic problem with the tools available to him? There's a strong argument to be made that Charles, despite his best intentions, actually weakened his empire by sacrificing long-term strategic advantages and depleting the treasury in his relentless pursuit of signatures. He focused so much on securing the legality of Maria Theresa's succession that he neglected to ensure the strength of the state she would inherit. The betrayal of the European powers, particularly France, Bavaria, and Prussia, who had solemnly sworn to uphold the pragmatic sanction, is a stark reminder of the cynical nature of 18th century diplomacy. Their motivations were purely opportunistic, the chance to carve up a weakened female-led empire. Frederick the Great's invasion of Silesia, in particular, is often viewed as a masterclass in ruthless realpolitik. He had signed the pragmatic sanction, but saw no moral or legal compunction in breaking his word when it suited his interests. His justification, that Salic law, which didn't strictly apply to the Habsburg lands in this manner, superseded the pragmatic sanction, was a thin veil for pure aggression. This period raises profound questions about international law and the enforceability of treaties. Was the pragmatic sanction doomed from the start because it challenged such fundamental patriarchal principles? Or could it have held if Charles VI had left his daughter with a full treasury and a formidable army? The prevailing view among many historians is that while the pragmatic sanction provided a legal basis for Maria Theresa's claim, it was ultimately military strength and diplomatic acumen, which she herself would have to provide, that truly secured her throne. The document itself was important, but it was Maria Theresa's fierce defense of it, not its mere existence, that proved decisive. Another controversy often discussed is the role of gender in this crisis. Did the European powers launch the War of the Austrian Succession because Maria Theresa was a woman, believing she would be weak and easily subdued? Or was her gender simply an excuse for ambitions that would have arisen regardless of who sat on the Habsburg throne? While male heirs often face challenges to their succession, the specific vulnerability attributed to Maria Theresa due to her sex was undeniably a major factor. The contemporary attitudes towards female rule were largely dismissive, often portraying women as inherently incapable of governing effectively, especially in wartime. This ingrained sexism undoubtedly emboldened her enemies. However, paradoxically, her gender also became a powerful tool. Her appeal to the Hungarian magnates holding her infant son was precisely an invocation of her vulnerability as a woman and mother, yet it transformed into a powerful symbol of strength and determination. She was able to rally support through emotional appeals that might have seemed less authentic coming from a hardened male monarch. Her very weakness became a source of unexpected power. The controversy lies in understanding the extent to which her gender was both a liability and ultimately a unique asset in her desperate fight for survival. The political fragmentation of the Habsburg monarchy itself also contributed to the crisis. It was not a unified nation-state, but a collection of disparate lands, each with its own laws, customs, and sometimes its own interpretation of loyalty to the Habsburg crown. This inherent weakness was expertly exploited by her enemies. Bavaria's elector, Charles Albert, for instance, even claimed the imperial throne himself, further fracturing the tenuous unity of the Holy Roman Empire, of which the Habsburg ruler was traditionally the emperor. This internal disunity, inherited from centuries of patchwork expansion, made Maria Theresa's initial position even more precarious. The question of whether such a diverse empire could ever truly be governed by a single central authority without constant internal strife would be a challenge she wrestled with throughout her entire reign. Her early trials demonstrated that securing her external borders was only half the battle. Unifying her internal domains was an equally formidable task. We left Maria Theresa in a desperate, almost hopeless situation. Her father was dead, her treasury was empty, and her enemies were closing in from all sides. Frederick of Prussia had brazenly seized Silesia, and a powerful coalition led by France and Bavaria was advancing deep into the heart of her domains. Yet her impassioned plea to the Hungarian Diet had secured a vital lifeline, an army, fueled by a renewed sense of loyalty. This was the turning point, not an end to her troubles, but the beginning of a real fight. The young, untested Archduchess was about to show Europe the true meaning of Habsburg resilience. The winter of 1741 was one of the bleakest in the dynasty's history. The combined Franco-Bavarian forces, under the command of the Elector of Bavaria, Charles Albert, swept through Upper Austria and into Bohemia. On November 26, they captured Prague, the ancient and prestigious capital of the Bohemian kingdom. The loss was a staggering blow, both militarily and psychologically. Shortly after, Charles Albert had himself crowned King of Bohemia, a direct usurpation of one of Maria Theresa's most important titles. For Maria Theresa, watching from Vienna, this must have felt like the world was collapsing. Every dispatch brought worse news. Her own ministers whispered of appeasement, suggesting she cede territory, make a deal, and salvage what she could. But Maria Theresa's spirit was unyielding. In a letter written during this dark time, she declared, "I am only a poor queen, but I have the heart of a king." This was not mere bravado. It was a statement of profound intent. She refused to be a victim. She would be a warrior. The ultimate humiliation came in January 1742. With the support of France and Prussia, Charles Albert of Bavaria was elected Holy Roman Emperor in Frankfurt, taking the title Charles VII. For over 3 centuries, with only one brief interruption, the imperial crown had rested on a Habsburg head. It was the source of their immense prestige and their claim to be the preeminent rulers of the German-speaking world. Now it was held by the very man who was trying to dismember her inheritance. This was not just a political loss, it was a deeply personal affront to her family's legacy and honor. Maria Theresa famously refused to acknowledge the election, referring to the new emperor only as the Bavarian Elector. But even in this darkest hour, the tide was beginning to turn. The Hungarian troops, fierce and loyal, were now mobilized, and Maria Theresa had found a capable general in Ludwig Andreas von Khevenhuller. While her enemies were celebrating their triumph in Prague and Frankfurt, Khevenhuller launched a brilliant and unexpected winter campaign. He drove the Franco-Bavarian forces out of Austria and, in a stunning reversal of fortune, marched directly into Bavaria. On the very day Charles Albert was being crowned emperor in Frankfurt, Maria Theresa's troops marched into his own capital, Munich. The symbolism was potent and devastating. The new emperor was now a man without a country, a ruler in exile from his own lands. This counter-offensive breathed new life into Maria Theresa's cause. It demonstrated that she was not a pushover and that her armies were still a force to be reckoned with. It also began to shift the complex web of European alliances. Great Britain, under King George II, had a vested interest in maintaining the balance of power in Europe and preventing France from becoming too dominant. Britain was also linked to the continent through George's personal rule of Hanover in Germany. Seeing Maria Theresa's determined resistance, they began to provide her with crucial financial subsidies and diplomatic support. The war was expanding, becoming a wider European conflict with Britain and Austria on one side, and France, Bavaria, and Prussia on the other. Despite these successes, the situation in Silesia remained dire. Frederick the Great's army was modern, disciplined, and brilliantly led. Maria Theresa's forces in the region were outmatched. In May 1742, at the Battle of Chotusitz, Frederick inflicted another decisive defeat on the Austrians. This loss was a bitter pill for Maria Theresa. She was now fighting a war on two fronts, and she realized with immense reluctance that she could not defeat all her enemies at once. To focus on her main threat, the Franco-Bavarian coalition, she had to make a painful sacrifice. Pressured by her British allies, who wanted to simplify the conflict, Maria Theresa agreed to secret negotiations with Frederick. In June 1742, she signed the Treaty of Breslau, formally ceding the majority of Silesia to Prussia. The decision tore her apart. Silesia was not just a piece of land. It was a prosperous, resource-rich province, and a jewel in the Habsburg crown. Giving it up felt like a betrayal of her inheritance, a concession forced upon her by circumstance. She reportedly wept as she agreed to the terms. But it was a calculated, pragmatic decision. By making peace with her most dangerous military opponent, she could now turn the full force of her armies against the French and Bavarians. This act, born of desperation, reveals the core of her emerging political genius, an ability to blend unwavering determination with ruthless pragmatism when necessary. The loss of Silesia would leave a deep scar on her soul, and her secret vow to one day reclaim it would shape her foreign policy for the next 2 decades. With Prussia temporarily out of the war, the momentum shifted decisively in Austria's favor. Throughout 1742 and 1743, her forces, often commanded by her brother-in-law Charles of Lorraine, steadily pushed the French back. They recaptured Prague and cleared all enemy forces from Bohemia. In June 1743, a combined force of Austrian, British, and Hanoverian troops, known as the Pragmatic Army, met the French at the Battle of Dettingen in Germany. The battle was a major victory for the Allies, notable for being the last time a reigning British monarch, George II, personally led his troops in battle. The war was far from over, but Maria Theresa had achieved the impossible. From the brink of total collapse, she had rallied her forces, secured a powerful ally, driven her enemies from her core territories, and exposed the so-called Holy Roman Emperor as a powerless figurehead. She had survived her baptism of fire. The young girl, who had inherited a crumbling state, was now recognized across Europe as a formidable and tenacious ruler. She had earned her crown not by birthright alone, but through blood, sacrifice, and an iron will. However, her very success sowed the seeds of the next crisis. Frederick the Great watched Austria's resurgence with growing alarm. He had taken Silesia on the assumption that the Habsburg monarchy would be permanently weakened. Now, seeing Maria Theresa's armies victorious and her position strengthening, he began to fear that she would soon turn on him to reclaim her lost province. Frederick, ever the preemptive strategist, decided to strike first. In August 1744, he broke the Treaty of Breslau and re-entered the war, invading Bohemia and launching what became known as the Second Silesian War. Once again, Maria Theresa was plunged into a desperate struggle. The Prussian invasion forced her armies to pull back from their campaign against France to defend the homeland. Frederick captured Prague for a second time, but this time Maria Theresa was a different ruler. She was no longer an inexperienced novice, but a seasoned wartime leader. She rallied her people with patriotic fervor, and the Hungarians once again provided crucial military support. Though Frederick won a series of tactical victories, he was unable to land a knockout blow. The Austrian resistance was far stiffer than he had anticipated, and his own resources were stretched thin. A crucial turning point came in January 1745. Charles Albert, the Bavarian emperor and Maria Theresa's rival, died unexpectedly. His son and heir had no interest in pursuing his father's ruinous imperial ambitions and quickly signed a peace treaty with Maria Theresa, taking Bavaria out of the war and pledging his vote for her husband in the next imperial election. This was a monumental victory. The cornerstone of the coalition against her had crumbled. With Bavaria out of the picture, Maria Theresa and her allies could focus on securing the imperial title for her husband, Francis Stephen. In September 1745, their efforts paid off. Francis Stephen was elected Holy Roman Emperor Francis I. For Maria Theresa, this was a moment of immense personal and political triumph. She had restored the imperial dignity to her family. Watching the coronation from a balcony, she was the first to cry, "Vivat! Long may he live!" Her voice filled with pride and relief. She might not be able to wear the imperial crown herself due to her gender, but she had ensured it rested on the head of her beloved husband, effectively making them a ruling imperial partnership. From that day on, she was universally known by her highest title, Empress. Despite this triumph, the war against Frederick of Prussia dragged on. He inflicted another series of defeats on the Austrians in 1745, but his position was becoming untenable. His French allies were providing little support in Germany, and his treasury was running dry. By the end of the year, both sides were exhausted. On Christmas Day, 1745, they signed the Treaty of Dresden. The terms were almost identical to the previous treaty. Maria Theresa once again had to acknowledge Prussian control of Silesia, and in return, Frederick recognized her husband as Holy Roman Emperor. The Second Silesian War was over. The wider war of the Austrian succession continued for another 3 years, fought mainly in Italy and the Low Countries between Austria and its allies, and France and Spain. It was a grinding, costly affair, with victories and defeats on both sides. By 1748, all parties were exhausted and financially drained. Peace negotiations began, culminating in the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. The treaty was, in essence, a grand continent-wide acknowledgement of the status quo. All the powers, at long last, formally recognized the pragmatic sanction. Maria Theresa's right to rule the Habsburg lands was now undisputed. Her husband's title as Holy Roman Emperor was also universally accepted. She had successfully defended her inheritance against a continent of predators. She had saved her empire, but the price of this victory was bitter. The treaty confirmed, for a third and final time, the cession of Silesia to Prussia. She also had to cede some Italian territories to Spain and Parma. For Maria Theresa, the treaty was a source of profound dissatisfaction. She felt abandoned by her allies, particularly the British, whom she believed had forced her to accept the permanent loss of Silesia for their own strategic ends. She had won the war for her succession, but she had lost a vital piece of her realm in the process. The 8-year-long ordeal was finally over. Maria Theresa, now 31 years old, was a monarch transformed. The naive archduchess was gone, replaced by a hardened, pragmatic, and sometimes cynical empress. She had learned brutal lessons about power, diplomacy, and betrayal. She understood now that treaties were meaningless without military strength to back them up. She had seen the deep-seated weaknesses of her administration, the inefficiency of her tax system, and the inadequacies of her army. The war had been a trial by fire, and while she had not emerged unscathed, she had emerged infinitely stronger and wiser. As peace settled over Europe, Maria Theresa did not rest. For her, the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle was not an end, but merely an armistice. In her mind, the fight for Silesia was not over. The experience of the war had convinced her that to survive and to one day achieve her goal of revenge against Frederick, the Habsburg monarchy needed to be fundamentally and radically reformed from the ground up. The War of Succession was over. The revolution from above was about to begin. The peace signed at Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748 brought an end to the bloodshed. But for Maria Theresa, it was no cause for celebration. It was a bitter, humiliating truce. She had saved her crown and secured her husband's imperial title, but the price, the permanent loss of Silesia, was a wound that would never heal. Every time she looked at a map of her domains, the missing province was a glaring reminder of her defeat and of Frederick the Great's treachery. She saw the treaty not as a conclusion, but as a temporary ceasefire, a breathing space to prepare for the inevitable next round. The war had taught her a brutal lesson. Her empire, in its current state, was a lumbering, inefficient giant. It was a relic of a feudal age, unable to compete with the lean, centralized, and militarized machine that was Frederick's Prussia. If she was to survive, let alone reclaim what was hers, everything had to change. Thus began one of the most remarkable periods of transformation in European history, often called Maria Theresa's Revolution from Above. It was a series of sweeping domestic reforms aimed at forging a modern centralized state from the patchwork of medieval provinces she had inherited. This wasn't just about administrative tidying. It was a radical overhaul of the very foundations of Habsburg power, driven by one burning, all-consuming ambition: revenge on Prussia. Her first and most urgent priority was the state's finances and administration. The war had laid bare the fatal weakness of the old system. The monarch had to go cap in hand to the various regional diets or assemblies of nobles in each province to beg for taxes and troops. These diets were dominated by the clergy and the nobility, who were themselves exempt from most taxes. They would haggle, delay, and grant funds for only a year at a time, making long-term financial or military planning impossible. It was a system designed to keep the central government weak and the privileges of the aristocracy strong. Maria Theresa knew this had to be destroyed. To spearhead this monumental task, she found the perfect instrument: Count Friedrich Wilhelm von Haugwitz. A stern, tireless, and notoriously blunt administrator from Silesia, Haugwitz had seen firsthand the efficiency of the Prussian system and was convinced Austria must emulate it to survive. He proposed a plan that was nothing short of revolutionary. He wanted to strip the provincial diets of their power over taxation and the military, and create a single, centralized body in Vienna to oversee administration and revenue collection for the entire monarchy, with the notable exception of Hungary, whose fierce independence required a more delicate touch. In 1749, This vision became a reality with the creation of the Directorium in Publicis et Cameralibus, Directory for Public and Cameral Affairs. This new superministry, with Haugwitz at its head, effectively bypassed the old cumbersome chanceries. More radically, Haugwitz proposed that the diets agree to a fixed contribution for a period of 10 years, a 10-year recess. This would give the state a predictable, stable income, allowing it to maintain a standing army of over 100,000 men, even in peacetime. And here was the most explosive part of the plan. To meet these quotas, the nobility and the clergy, for the first time in their history, would have to pay taxes on their land and income. Imagine the uproar. For centuries, tax exemption had been the most sacred privilege of the aristocracy, the very definition of their elite status. Now this empress was demanding they pay their share to fund her army. The opposition was fierce and immediate. Nobles across the empire protested, they intrigued, they invoked ancient charters and privileges. They accused Haugwitz of tyranny and of destroying their traditional way of life. But Maria Theresa stood by her minister with unwavering resolve. She was not asking, she was telling. She used a combination of persuasion, pressure, and sheer force of will. She argued that the security of the state, and therefore the security of their own lands, depended on a strong, well-funded army. She reminded them of the chaos of the recent war and warned them that without these reforms, the next war would mean total destruction. To those who still resisted, she was ruthless, dismissing them from their posts and overriding their objections. It was a titanic political struggle, but she won. The Haugwitz reforms were implemented, and for the first time, the Habsburg monarchy had the financial foundation of a modern European power. To ensure the new taxes were assessed fairly and efficiently, she also commissioned a massive land survey, a comprehensive cadastre of her domains, so that no nobleman could hide the true extent of his wealth. With a steady stream of revenue now secured, Maria Theresa turned her attention to the instrument of her future revenge, the army. The War of the Austrian Succession had revealed its glaring deficiencies. Officers were often appointed based on aristocratic lineage rather than merit. Training was inconsistent, and equipment was substandard. It was no match for the superbly drilled infantry of Frederick the Great. Maria Theresa sought to create a truly professional military. In 1751, she founded one of her most enduring legacies, the Theresian Military Academy, Theresianische Militärakademie, in Wiener Neustadt. This was a groundbreaking institution, one of the first of its kind in the world, dedicated to training a corps of professional officers based on skill, discipline, and loyalty to the crown, not just noble birth. Cadets received a rigorous education in military science, tactics, engineering, and even ethics. She also established military schools for common soldiers and standardized uniforms, drill regulations, and artillery. Her goal was to forge an army that was not just a collection of provincial regiments, but a single unified imperial force, loyal to her and her alone. But her vision of a stronger state went far beyond finance and the military. She understood that the true strength of a nation lay in its people. This led her to embark on a series of educational and social reforms that were, for their time, remarkably enlightened. A devout Catholic herself, she nonetheless believed that the Church had become too powerful and too independent from the state. She began to assert state control over the Church, curbing its privileges, taxing its vast landholdings, and reducing the number of religious holidays, which she believed encouraged idleness. Her most profound impact was in education. She believed that an educated populace would create better soldiers, more efficient bureaucrats, and more productive citizens. In 1774, she issued the General School Regulation, a revolutionary decree that established a state-run system of primary schools, Volksschulen, throughout her German and Austrian lands. For the first time, education was made compulsory for both boys and girls of a certain age. The state, not the church, would now dictate the curriculum, which focused on literacy, arithmetic, morality, and practical skills. While the reality often fell short of the grand vision due to lack of funds and teachers, it was a monumental step towards universal public education, aimed at creating a more unified and loyal citizenry. Simultaneously, she embarked on a massive legal reform project. The laws across the Habsburg lands were a chaotic medieval tangle of local customs and precedents. She commissioned a unified civil law code, the Codex Theresianus. Although it proved too complex and was never fully implemented in her lifetime, it laid the essential groundwork for the Austrian civil code that would follow. More immediately, she took a firm stand against some of the most barbaric practices of the age. In 1776, she formally abolished the use of torture in the justice system. She also put an end to witch trials and burning, which, while rare, still occurred in remote parts of her empire. These were not the actions of a despot, but of a ruler genuinely concerned with justice and humane governance, albeit within the framework of her absolute power. Throughout this whirlwind of reform, Maria Theresa's personal life was as demanding as ever. The mother of an empire was also the mother of a rapidly growing family. During these years of peace and reform, she gave birth to some of her most famous children, including Maria Carolina, the future Queen of Naples and Sicily, Ferdinand, and in 1755, Maria Antonia, the little Archduchess the world would come to know as Marie Antoinette. Her daily routine was famously grueling. She would rise at dawn, attend Mass, and then plunge into a relentless schedule of meetings, reading state papers, and dictating correspondence that would often last late into the night. Yet she always carved out time for her family. Schönbrunn Palace, which she had extensively rebuilt and redecorated in a magnificent Rococo style, became both the center of government and a bustling family home. She insisted on a relatively informal family life, at least by the standards of the time. She supervised her children's education personally, and her letters to them are filled with a mixture of maternal affection, stern advice, and constant worry. She was a loving mother, but also a demanding one, deeply aware that her children were not just individuals, but dynastic assets, whose marriages would be crucial instruments of her foreign policy. Her relationship with her husband, Emperor Francis Stephen, settled into a comfortable and effective partnership. While she was the undisputed sovereign of the Habsburg lands, he managed the imperial court and, more significantly, proved to be an exceptionally astute businessman. He invested wisely, managed the family's vast private estates brilliantly, and amassed an enormous personal fortune, which often came in handy to supplement the state treasury. They remained deeply devoted to each other, a stable and loving center in a world of constant political maneuvering. As the 1750s progressed, all of Maria Theresa's reforms, financial, military, and social, were beginning to bear fruit. The state was more solvent, the army was larger and better trained, and the administration was more efficient than ever before. Austria was re-emerging as a true European heavyweight, and all this time, in the back of her mind, was Silesia. With the domestic front secured, she turned her full attention to foreign policy, and here again, she found the perfect man for the job, Wenzel Anton von Kaunitz, a brilliant, foppish, and supremely arrogant diplomat. Kaunitz was a strategic visionary. He had come to the same conclusion as Maria Theresa. The old system of European alliances was obsolete. For centuries, European politics had been defined by the rivalry between the Habsburgs and the Bourbon kings of France. Great Britain had traditionally been Austria's ally against French power. Kaunitz argued that this was now a strategic dead end. Britain, an island trading power, had proven to be an unreliable ally on the continent, primarily concerned with its colonial rivalry with France. The real existential threat to Austria, Kaunitz argued, was not France, but the aggressive, expansionist power of Prussia. Therefore, the old logic had to be turned on its head. Austria's natural enemy, France, must become its new best friend. An alliance between Austria and France, the two greatest continental powers, could encircle and crush the upstart Frederick the Great once and for all. This proposal, an alliance with the hated French, was a diplomatic bombshell, a shocking reversal of 250 years of history. It was met with disbelief and horror by many of Vienna's old guard politicians. But Maria Theresa, with her pragmatic and unsentimental approach to power, saw the cold, hard logic in Kaunitz's vision. She gave him her full backing. Beginning in 1750, Kaunitz, as her ambassador to Versailles and later as her state chancellor, began the slow, delicate process of what would become known as the diplomatic revolution. He worked tirelessly to overcome centuries of ingrained hostility and suspicion between the courts of Vienna and Versailles. It was a diplomatic masterstroke, patiently executed over several years. He played on French fears of Prussia's growing power and on the personal influence of King Louis XV's mistress, Madame de Pompadour, who despised Frederick the Great for his constant mockery of her. Slowly but surely, the pieces on the European chessboard began to shift. The foundations for a grand coalition against Prussia were being laid. Maria Theresa's reformed state and revitalized army were ready. Her new diplomatic strategy was taking shape. The years of patient, painstaking preparation were coming to an end. The Empress had rebuilt her empire, and now she was ready to unleash it. The stage was set for a new, even more terrible conflict, a war that would not just be for a single province, but for the mastery of Germany and the balance of power in Europe itself. The diplomatic revolution was complete. The board was set, the pieces were in motion, and the air over Europe crackled with the electric tension of impending war. For years, Maria Theresa and her brilliant Chancellor Kaunitz had meticulously worked to isolate their great nemesis, Frederick of Prussia. The historic centuries-old rivalry with France had been set aside for a new pragmatic alliance. Russia, under the fiercely anti-Prussian Empress Elizabeth, was also firmly in their camp, as was Sweden. Prussia was encircled. Numerically, the odds were overwhelming. On paper, it looked like a guaranteed victory. Maria Theresa, now a seasoned and resolute monarch of 39, felt a surge of grim optimism. The moment to avenge the theft of Silesia, the defining humiliation of her youth, was finally at hand. But they had all made one critical miscalculation. They underestimated Frederick the Great's audacity. He was not a man to sit and wait for the trap to close. A brilliant and ruthless strategist, he knew his only chance of survival was to strike first, to disrupt his enemy's preparations and seize the initiative. In August 1756, without a formal declaration of war, Frederick marched the Prussian army into the neutral territory of Saxony. The invasion was swift, brutal, and effective. He seized the Saxon capital, Dresden, captured its army, and, most importantly, confiscated state papers that proved the existence of the secret defensive coalition against him, which he then published to justify his aggression to the world. Frederick's preemptive strike had ignited the continent. The conflict, which would expand into a global struggle between Britain and France known as the French and Indian War in North America was now a reality in Europe. It was the 7 Years' War. The first year of the war was a series of indecisive but bloody encounters. Frederick had caught his enemies off guard, but the sheer weight of the coalition against him was immense. For Maria Theresa, the moment of truth came on June 18, 1757. At the Battle of Kolin in Bohemia, the Austrian army under the command of the cautious but steady Marshal Leopold von Daun met Frederick's forces. Frederick, uncharacteristically overconfident, made a series of tactical blunders. The Austrians held their ground with grim determination and for the first time ever inflicted a major undeniable battlefield defeat on Frederick the Great himself. The news of the victory at Kolin sent shock waves of euphoria through Vienna. The city erupted in celebration. Maria Theresa was overcome with joy and gratitude. She had proved that the monster of Prussia was not invincible. In a spontaneous gesture of immense gratitude, she established a new military honor, the Military Order of Maria Theresa, to reward acts of extraordinary bravery by her officers. Its first Grand Cross was awarded fittingly to Marshal Daun. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed that her great gamble would pay off. The path to reclaiming Silesia lay open. The coalition now pressed its advantage on all fronts. A French army advanced into Germany, a Russian army marched into East Prussia, and the Swedes attacked from the north. Frederick was surrounded, outnumbered, and on the run. His situation looked utterly hopeless. But it is in moments of desperation that genius often shines brightest. In one of the most remarkable turnarounds in military history, Frederick demonstrated why he was considered a master of war. In the space of a single month, he saved his kingdom. On November 5th, 1757, at the Battle of Rossbach, he met a combined French and German army that was more than double his size. Using speed, deception, and the superior discipline of his troops, he utterly annihilated them in less than 90 minutes. It was a humiliating rout for the French and a stunning victory for Prussia. Then, hearing that the main Austrian army had entered Silesia and captured its capital, Breslau, he force-marched his exhausted troops over 170 miles in 12 days. On December 5th, exactly 1 month after Rossbach, he confronted a much larger Austrian army under Charles of Lorraine at the Battle of Leuthen. In what is still considered a tactical masterpiece, Frederick used a strategy of feigned attacks and oblique order of battle to crush the Austrian flank and roll up their entire line. The Austrian army was shattered. By the end of the month, Frederick had recaptured Breslau and undone all of Maria Theresa's gains. The news of Rossbach, and especially Leuthen, plunged Vienna into despair. The wild optimism of the summer turned into a winter of grief and recrimination. Maria Theresa was devastated. The enemy she had thought was on the ropes had, in 2 lightning blows, completely reversed the course of the war. Her brother-in-law, Charles of Lorraine, who had commanded the army at Leuthen, was so disgraced that he was relieved of his command and effectively retired from military service. The emotional whiplash was severe, but Maria Theresa's resolve did not break. If anything, the defeats hardened her. She now understood the full measure of her opponent. This would not be a short, triumphant campaign. It would be a long, brutal war of attrition. And so it became. The next few years were a bloody, grinding stalemate. The war became a meat grinder, consuming hundreds of thousands of lives and devastating vast swathes of Central Europe. Maria Theresa, from her palace in Vienna, was the unblinking spider at the center of the coalition's web. She was no longer just a symbol. She was the supreme commander of the war effort. She worked tirelessly, managing the complex diplomacy of the alliance, securing funds, and appointing and dismissing generals. She skillfully managed the cautious Marshal Daun, who was excellent at planning and defense but reluctant to risk a decisive battle, and promoted brilliant but aggressive commanders like the fiery Baron Ernst von Lauden. There were moments of hope. In 1758, at the Battle of Hochkirch, Daun and Lauden managed to surprise Frederick in a pre-dawn attack, inflicting a rare defeat on him. In 1760, Lauden even briefly captured Berlin itself, a huge symbolic victory that allowed the Austrians and Russians to loot the Prussian capital. For Maria Theresa, the news that her troops marched in Frederick's capital must have been a moment of sweet, if temporary, revenge. The most promising moment of the entire war came on August 12, 1759. At the Battle of Kunersdorf, a combined Austro-Russian army met Frederick's forces. The result was the single most catastrophic defeat of Frederick's entire career. The Prussian army was not just beaten, it was annihilated. As dusk fell on the battlefield, Frederick had barely 3,000 men left under his command. He was plunged into the depths of despair. In a letter written that night, he abdicated his command and spoke of suicide, writing, "I believe all is lost." This was it. This was the moment Maria Theresa had worked for, prayed for, and sacrificed for. Her enemy was broken, his army destroyed. One final coordinated push by the victorious Allies would have ended the war and sealed the fate of Prussia. But it was not to be. The Allied commanders dithered. The Austrian and Russian generals distrusted each other and could not agree on the next move. The golden opportunity to march on a defenseless Berlin and dictate terms was lost. This failure to capitalize on the victory at Kunersdorf would haunt the Allies and prove to be a fatal error. Slowly, miraculously, Frederick managed to piece together a new army. The war dragged on for 2 more bloody years. By the end of 1761, however, Prussia was on its last legs. The British, under a new government, had cut off their crucial financial subsidies. The Prussian treasury was empty, its manpower exhausted. Frederick was completely surrounded, holding on by a thread, his enemies closing in for the kill. He saw no way out. Defeat seemed not just likely, but absolutely inevitable. And then on January 5th, 1762, the course of history was changed not by a battle, but by a death. In St. Petersburg, Empress Elizabeth of Russia, Frederick's implacable foe, died of a stroke. Her successor was her nephew, Tsar Peter III. Peter was a strange and deeply unpopular figure who, bizarrely, idolized Frederick the Great. He considered Frederick a military genius and Prussia the model state. One of his very first acts as Tsar was to pull Russia out of the war. He didn't just make peace, he signed an alliance with Frederick and ordered his armies, which had been fighting the Prussians just weeks before, to now fight alongside them against the Austrians. This stunning turn of events was what Frederick himself would later call the miracle of the House of Brandenburg. For Maria Theresa, it was a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. It was a dagger to the heart, a cruel twist of fate that snatched certain victory from her grasp. Her most powerful ally was suddenly gone. Its armies now turned against her. The entire strategic balance of the war had been shattered overnight. Sweden soon followed Russia in making peace, and the grand coalition that Kaunitz and Maria Theresa had so painstakingly built completely fell apart. She was left to fight on, but her resources were drained and her spirit was crushed. The war had lost its purpose. Her French allies, having suffered disastrous colonial defeats at the hands of the British, were also looking for a way out. The fighting petered out in a state of mutual exhaustion. Peace negotiations began, and on February 15, 1763, Austria and Prussia signed the Treaty of Hubertusburg. The terms were stark in their simplicity. A return to the status quo antebellum, the state that existed before the war. All conquered territories were to be returned. The borders would be exactly as they had been in 1756. For Maria Theresa, this was the ultimate defeat. 7 years of brutal warfare, over 1 million soldiers and civilians dead, her lands devastated, her treasury bankrupt. All the sacrifice, all the bloodshed, all the moments of hope and despair had amounted to nothing. Silesia was still in Frederick's hands now and forever. The great gamble had failed. She had thrown everything she had at her enemy and lost. The war that was meant to be her crowning achievement had ended in bitter, heartbreaking failure. She was forced to accept a reality she had fought her entire life to deny. The dream of reclaiming her lost province was dead. The Treaty of Habsburg in 1763 did not bring peace to Maria Theresa's soul. It brought a profound and lasting weariness. The Great War, the defining struggle of her middle years, had ended in a colossal failure. The immense cost in blood and treasure had purchased nothing but the status quo. She was now in her late 40s, and the ordeal had taken its toll. The fiery, defiant queen who had rallied the Hungarian nobles was now a more somber, cautious, and profoundly war-averse empress. She had seen the horrifying abyss of total war and had no desire to ever approach it again. Her focus shifted inward, toward domestic consolidation, the welfare of her people, and, above all, the preservation of peace. But fate was about to deliver a blow far more personal and devastating than any battlefield defeat. On August 18, 1765, the imperial family was in Innsbruck celebrating the wedding of her son, Leopold. Her beloved husband, Emperor Francis Stephen, who had been in good spirits, suddenly collapsed and died from a massive stroke or heart attack. His death shattered her world. Theirs was a genuine love match, a partnership that had endured the immense pressures of rule for nearly 3 decades. He was her confidant, her emotional anchor, the father of her 16 children. In the cold, calculating world of dynastic politics, he was the one person with whom she could be vulnerable. His sudden absence created a void that could never be filled. Maria Theresa's grief was absolute, all-consuming, and almost pathological in its intensity. It would define the remaining 15 years of her life. Her first act was to cut off her long, beautiful hair. She gave away all her lavish gowns, her magnificent jewelry, and her colorful decorations, distributing them among her ladies in waiting. From that day until her own death, she wore nothing but the simple, severe black of a widow. Her chambers were redecorated in stark black and gray. She spent hours each day in prayer in a room draped with black velvet, contemplating mortality and her own salvation. She referred to herself in letters as an old broken woman and began meticulously preparing for her own death, even designing her own tomb where she would lie beside her beloved Francis. This wasn't a temporary state of mourning. It was a permanent transformation. The vibrant, life-loving Empress was gone, replaced by a solemn, perpetually grieving matriarch. Yet her sense of duty was too deeply ingrained for her to abandon the throne. She would continue to rule, but now her work was tinged with a deep melancholy and an almost obsessive concern for the spiritual well-being of her family and her subjects. Francis's death also had profound political consequences. Her eldest son, Joseph, who was 24, now automatically succeeded his father as Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II. But the imperial title, while prestigious, held little direct power. The real authority lay in the Habsburg lands, Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary, which Joseph could only inherit upon his mother's death. Maria Theresa recognizing his ambition and intelligence, but also deeply distrusting his radical ideas, made a crucial decision. She appointed him co-regent. He would now share in the day-to-day governance of the monarchy. It was a decision born of love and political necessity, but it set the stage for one of the most fascinating and fraught political relationships of the 18th century. It was a clash not just of generations, but of entire worldviews. Maria Theresa, scarred by war and rooted in her deep Catholic faith, had become a cautious, pragmatic conservative. She believed in gradual reform, in respecting tradition, and in a divinely ordained social order. Her rule was paternalistic, or rather, maternalistic. She saw herself as the mother of her people, responsible for their material and spiritual welfare. But she had no patience for abstract theories that threatened to disrupt the stability she had fought so hard to maintain. Joseph, on the other hand, was the quintessential enlightened absolutist, a man whose mind was ablaze with the radical ideas of the French philosophes. He was brilliant, impatient, dogmatic, and utterly convinced of the power of pure reason. He saw tradition as an obstacle, privilege as an injustice, and the church as a bastion of superstition. He admired his mother's old enemy, Frederick the Great, not for his treachery, but for his ice-cold efficiency. Joseph wanted to tear down the entire messy, illogical medieval structure of the Habsburg state and rebuild it from the ground up as a perfectly rational, centralized, and uniform machine. The 15 years of their co-regency were a period of constant, grinding conflict, a relentless tug-of-war between mother and son, fought out in letters, memoranda, and heated arguments in the council chambers of the Habsburg Palace. Their clashes ranged across every aspect of policy. Joseph, for instance, was a staunch advocate of religious toleration. He saw no reason why Protestants, Orthodox Christians, and even Jews should not have the freedom to worship and contribute to the state. To Maria Theresa, this was an abomination. While she had curtailed the political power of the Catholic Church, her personal faith was absolute. She saw it as her sacred duty to protect the souls of her subjects from heresy. The idea of granting rights to unbelievers horrified her. "Is there no longer a question of God and His Church?" she lamented in a letter. "Is there nothing to hold us back when we are on the direct road to ruining the state and bringing about a revolution?" They fought bitterly over the issue of serfdom. Joseph wanted to abolish it entirely at a stroke, freeing the peasants from their feudal obligations to the nobility. He saw it as a moral stain and an economic absurdity. Maria Theresa sympathized with the plight of the peasants. She had, in fact, passed laws known as the robot patent to limit the amount of forced labor a lord could demand. But she feared that a sudden, radical abolition would lead to social chaos and economic collapse. She favored a slow, gradual approach, much to Joseph's intense frustration. Their most famous and painful conflict came over foreign policy. Joseph, like many young rulers, was ambitious. He saw an opportunity to expand the empire through a cynical act of power politics, the partition of Poland. The vast, weak Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was being destabilized by its powerful neighbors, Russia and Prussia. Frederick the Great proposed that the three powers simply carve off pieces of Poland for themselves to maintain the balance of power. Joseph was enthusiastic about the plan. It was a chance to acquire the valuable territory of Galicia with its rich salt mines. Maria Theresa was appalled. After the horrors of the 7 Years' War, she had become a genuine advocate for peace. The idea of dismembering a sovereign Catholic kingdom in a naked act of aggression deeply offended her moral and religious sensibilities. She saw it as no different from Frederick's theft of Silesia. When all my lands were challenged, she wrote, I stood firm on my good right. She argued passionately against the partition, seeing it as a stain on her family's honor. But she was outmaneuvered. Kaunitz, her veteran chancellor, sided with Joseph, arguing from a position of cold realpolitik that if Austria did not take a piece of Poland, Russia and Prussia would simply take more, leaving the monarchy relatively weaker. Caught between her conscience and the perceived needs of the state, Maria Theresa reluctantly gave her consent. Her famous, anguished comment on the matter reveals the depth of her inner conflict. She weeps, but she takes. For her, it was a moment of profound moral failure, a betrayal of the very principles she had once gone to war to defend. With conquest no longer her primary tool, Maria Theresa channeled her energies into a different kind of foreign policy, dynastic marriage. She became the mother-in-law of Europe, using her vast brood of children as pawns in a grand strategy to weave a web of alliances and secure peace. She once remarked, "A durable peace is worth a few bad marriages." This policy, however, came at an immense personal cost, both for her and for her children. She sent her daughter Maria Carolina to marry the boorish king of Naples, and Maria Amelia to the Duke of Parma, where she was deeply unhappy. Her son Leopold became Grand Duke of Tuscany, but the crown jewel of her dynastic strategy was the marriage of her youngest, prettiest, and most beloved daughter, Maria Antonia, better known as Marie Antoinette, to the heir to the French throne, the Dauphin Louis. This marriage was meant to cement the Franco-Austrian alliance, the cornerstone of Kaunitz's diplomatic revolution, and to ensure peace between the two great Catholic powers. In 1770, the 14-year-old Marie Antoinette was sent off to France. The separation was heartbreaking for Maria Theresa. She deluged her daughter with a constant stream of letters filled with loving advice, stern warnings, and detailed instructions on everything from her religious duties to how she should dress and behave at the notoriously decadent French court at Versailles. These letters reveal the heart of a worried mother, desperately trying to guide her naive young daughter through a political and social minefield from hundreds of miles away. "Don't forget your German heart," she pleaded, constantly reminding her daughter that she was, first and foremost, an Archduchess of Austria. Little did she know that this grand diplomatic triumph would ultimately lead her beloved child to the guillotine. The final years of Maria Theresa's life were a strange mixture of immense power and profound personal sadness. She was the revered matriarch of a vast empire, but she lived as a recluse, shrouded in black, her days marked by prayer and mourning. She was the absolute sovereign, but she had to constantly battle her own son for control over the future of her domains. She was the architect of European peace, but this peace was purchased by sending her own children into exile. She had transformed her state, modernized its institutions, and defended it against all odds. Yet she felt a deep sense of anxiety about the radical, godless world she saw her son trying to create. She had won her wars and secured her legacy, but the cost, measured in personal loss and moral compromise, had been immense. As the 1770s drew to a close, Maria Theresa's health began to fail. She suffered from obesity, shortness of breath, and a host of other ailments, likely exacerbated by a lifetime of stress and 16 pregnancies. Yet, she continued to work relentlessly, her sense of duty as strong as ever. The perpetual conflict with her son Joseph weighed heavily on her. She saw his radical, often tactless reforms as a threat to the very stability she had spent her life building. "He will ruin everything before I die," she once lamented, a premonition that would prove tragically astute. Her final years were a race against time, trying to moderate his impatience and preserve the traditional pillars of her rule, the church and the nobility, which he was so eager to tear down. On November 29, 1780, at the age of 63, Maria Theresa died, surrounded by her children. Her last words were reportedly directed at Joseph, a final, weary plea, do not be too hard on them. It was a fitting end for a ruler who, for all her imperial grandeur, always saw herself as the mother of her people. With her death, an era came to an end. The cautious, conservative, and deeply personal style of her rule was over. The age of Joseph II's radical, rationalist revolution was about to begin in earnest. To truly understand Maria Theresa's significance, we must look beyond the immediate circumstances of her death. We must look at the state she inherited and compare it to the one she left behind. She ascended the throne of a nearly bankrupt medieval monarchy that was on the verge of complete disintegration. Its army was weak, its administration was chaotic, and its very right to exist was challenged by all of its neighbors. She left behind a modern, centralized, and solvent European great power. Her legacy is not written in grand conquests, for her greatest war ended in failure, but in the profound and lasting internal transformation of the state itself. She was not a conqueror, she was an architect. Her most fundamental achievement was simply saving the Habsburg monarchy. Without her iron will in the early days of the War of the Austrian Succession, the empire would almost certainly have been partitioned and destroyed in 1740. She held it together through sheer force of personality, inspiring loyalty where none was guaranteed, and fighting on when all seemed lost. This act of survival alone would be enough to secure her place in history. But she did far more than just survive. Her sweeping domestic reforms laid the foundations for the modern Austrian state that would endure until 1918. The administrative and financial reforms of Haugwitz created a centralized bureaucracy and a stable tax base, allowing the state to function as a coherent entity rather than a loose collection of feudal provinces. She professionalized the army through institutions like the Theresian Military Academy, creating a force capable of defending the realm. Her legal reforms, which included the abolition of torture and the groundwork for a unified civil code, pushed the monarchy toward a more humane and rational system of justice. Perhaps her most revolutionary and far-reaching reform was in education. By establishing a state-run system of compulsory primary schools, she took a monumental step away from church-dominated education and toward the creation of a literate, unified citizenry. The goal was pragmatic, to produce better soldiers, administrators, and taxpayers, but the long-term effect was to fundamentally change the relationship between the state and its people, fostering a sense of shared identity where one had barely existed before. Maria Theresa also reshaped Europe as the great matriarch of a dynasty. As the mother-in-law of Europe, her children sat on the thrones of France, Naples, Parma, and Tuscany. While this policy of dynastic marriage had mixed results and often caused great personal unhappiness for her children, it successfully wove the House of Habsburg-Lorraine into the very fabric of European power, securing peace through blood ties, where treaties had so often failed. Her lineage would continue to influence European politics for generations, a living testament to her long-term strategic vision. She also occupies a unique and complex place in the Age of Enlightenment. Unlike her son Joseph or her rival Frederick, she was no disciple of the philosophe. She was deeply, unshakably Catholic and fundamentally conservative. She distrusted abstract reason and grand disruptive theories. Yet paradoxically, she implemented some of the most effective and enlightened reforms of the era. This is because her motivation was always pragmatic, not ideological. She reformed the state not to create a utopia, but to make it stronger. She limited the power of the church not out of anti-clerical sentiment, but because its untaxed wealth and political influence impeded the power of the crown. This makes her a fascinating figure, an enlightened absolutist by practice, if not by philosophy. She used the tools of the Enlightenment to achieve fundamentally conservative goals: the preservation of her dynasty and the security of her state. Finally, her reign was a landmark in the history of female leadership. In an age utterly dominated by men, she proved that a woman could govern, wage war, and reform a state with as much, if not more, skill and determination as any king. She was not a regent or a consort. She was a sovereign in her own right, the only woman to ever hold the position of head of the House of Habsburg. She shattered the prejudices of her time through sheer competence, earning the grudging respect of even her most chauvinistic opponents. She ruled as an empress, but she did so while embracing her identity as a wife and mother, seamlessly blending the demands of the state with the realities of her personal life in a way that was utterly unique. Maria Theresa's life was a grand and often tragic opera of duty, faith, and loss. She was the mother of empires, a ruler who inherited a crown of thorns, and through 4 decades of relentless struggle, transformed it into a symbol of enduring power. Her story is one of profound contradictions: the devoutly Catholic empress who engaged in cynical power politics, the loving mother who used her children as instruments of state, the conservative matriarch who enacted revolutionary reforms. She was not a flawless hero. She could be intolerant, stubborn, and ruthless, but her flaws make her human. Her struggles make her relatable. She endured the crucible of war, the heartbreak of a widow, and the constant friction with a son she both loved and feared. Through it all, her indomitable will never faltered. She fought for her inheritance not just as a legal right, but as a sacred maternal duty. In the end, Maria Theresa's greatest legacy is the empire she saved and rebuilt. She found the Habsburg monarchy a crumbling medieval relic and left it a modern, formidable power, ready to face the new challenges of a changing world. She was the true foundress of modern Austria, a woman who ruled with the heart of a king and the fierce protective love of a mother. Her life stands as a timeless testament to resilience, a powerful reminder that history is often shaped not by grand ideologies, but by the sheer, unyielding force of a single human spirit.